Good afternoon. Welcome to another segment of South Carolina history. When we stopped last week, we were talking about the ratification of the Constitution and South Carolinians' role in that. We were also talking about the nullification crisis in which South Carolina tested its relationship with the United States and found out that when it went too far leading towards secession, none of the other southern states would come in behind them, behind South Carolina. So on a national level, despite the prominence of John C. Calhoun, South Carolina acquired a reputation of being hot-headed, rash, and radical, and that was a term that was used both in the state and out of the state. One thing that Calhoun and others, actually other Southern leaders as well, hoped that if slavery was not discussed in Congress and not in the papers and what have you, then the issue would go away. It wouldn't be a national issue. But that wasn't to be the case. The House of Representatives had something it adopted in the 1820s called the gag rule, in which any petition from citizens that dealt with slavery would be automatically tabled so they couldn't discuss it. Well, in 1844, that gag rule was repealed. There were difficulties with the annexation of Texas. Would it be free? Would it be slave? Clearly it was going to be slave. But that was, again, a problem for Congress and for the country. The Compromise of 1850, the last of the great compromises at the national level prior to the Civil War, was the Compromise of 1850. It was over the admission of California as a free state. Now, you remember earlier when we talked about the Missouri Compromise, the idea was that there had been an equal number of free states and an equal number of slave states in the United States Senate. Well, if California were to be admitted as a free state, there was no further territory that could become slave to produce a slave state. And so there would be a compromise eventually on this matter. California would come in as a free state. New Mexico and Utah territories would be organized, but without any reference to slavery. The slave trade in the District of Columbia would be abolished, and a very strong fugitive slave law was enacted so that Southern planters and slave owners could reclaim their population, escaped slaves in the North, with the support of federal officials and marshals. Calhoun opposed the Compromise of 1850, and in his last speech to the United States Senate in 1850, just before he died, and in fact he was too ill himself to speak it, it was given by a fellow senator. He said, "I have, senators, believed from the first that the agitation of the subject of slavery will, if not prevented by some timely and effective measure, end in disunion." He said it was his opinion that slavery followed the flag. You could not forbid slavery in any part of the United States. Calhoun died in March 1850, was buried weeks later in Charleston, a tremendous national funeral. There was a Southern convention, and Southerners got pretty good at this in the 1840s and 50s, to debate issues, mostly trade and slavery. And the main purpose of this Nashville convention was to formulate a united Southern response to the Compromise of 1850. South Carolina's delegates weren't even listened to. As one other Southern delegate said, No arrangement which can be or will be made will satisfy South Carolina, so we're not going to pay any attention to what they have to say. Well, the National Convention was sound and fury, nothing really accomplished. So that's on the national level. But what's going on back home in South Carolina? Between 1850 and 1852, South Carolina divides into three political factions. You have radicals, people who want to secede day before yesterday. They're tired of being a part of the United States. You've got the cooperationists. These are people who are saying, okay, we can secede, but we got to have the rest of the South with us. Remember what happened in 1833-34? We said charge, and we looked behind, and where was Georgia? Where was Alabama? Where were the rest of the South? And then there were the Unionists who said, we need to stay in the United States. Now, interestingly, all three factions supported the institution of slavery, but each faction thought their way was the one to protect slavery the most. And in a series of local elections in 1851 and 1851, the cooperationists swept South Carolina. The radicals were absolutely flabbergasted that it happened. It was a tremendous upset, but basically, older statesmen had taken charge and said, look, we can't do this without the rest of the South. But that was really the calm before the storm, because on the national scene, the issue just wouldn't die down. In 1854, there was something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what it said was that the Kansas and Nebraska territory, in effect, repealed the Missouri Compromise and said, let the people of this new territory decide whether they'll be free or they'll be slave. It sounds like a really good idea. It's very democratic. Well, the result was what was called Bleeding Kansas. Abolitionists supported settlers into Kansas to make Kansas a free state. Southerners supported individuals settling in Kansas to make it a slave state. South Carolina voluntarily, individuals went to Kansas to settle. In fact, one low country couple got married and went to Kansas on their honeymoon. They raised money, and all of this, of course, fueled the national debate. In 1856, the Brooks-Sumner affair involving Congressman Preston Brooks of Edgefield from South Carolina. Senator Charles Sumner was an abolitionist. He was a radical abolitionist. And he gave a speech in the United States Senate that was personally offensive to South Carolina Senator A.P. Butler. It really was pretty ugly. Well, Congressman Preston Brooks was a cousin of Senator Butler's, and accompanied by fellow Congressman Lawrence Kit of Orangeburg, he attacked Sumner on the floor of the Senate with a cane and severely injured him. It became a national scandal. A majority of the House voted to expel Brooks, and Kit needed 2/3 to be expelled, so they both resigned and then were overwhelmingly reelected. Brooks unanimously, Kit not quite so, but overwhelmingly. And also in 1856, the Republican Party, newly organized, made a strong showing in the national elections. And one event just seems to follow right on another. You've got the Dred Scott case before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857, which basically said John C. Calhoun was right. Slavery follows the flag. And besides, a person of color can't be a citizen anyway. James H. Hammond, now a senator from South Carolina, said, "Cotton is king." It's his famous, he had several famous speeches in the U.S. Senate. "Cotton is king" speech. And he referred to every society has its mud sills. And then, of course, we come to John Brown's raid in 1859 at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. the radicals said, huh, we told you so. We told you so. Look at what's happened there. So in South Carolina, vigilante groups formed. Sometimes they call themselves the Minutemen. They harassed traveling salesmen, preachers, and teachers. Now you might wonder, this is a strange group. Well, most traveling salesmen were peddlers for New England enterprises. A great many clergy and school teachers were trained in New England, particularly at Princeton and Yale. In fact, Calhoun was a Yale graduate. And so because they were from the North, they might be bringing in abolitionist ideas that will infect the slaves, and then the slaves will rise up. And of course, there was a concern there, because by the time you get to 1859 and John Brown's raid, South Carolina is 60% African American, almost all of whom are enslaved persons. And besides the teachers and the preachers, we got to worry about circuses. Most of them come from up north. There's no telling what the acrobats or the person who's riding the elephant might do. And in order to limit these people, incredible bonds were set. A $55,000 bond for a traveling salesman to operate in South Carolina. And circuses were assessed a $1,700 daily fee. And vigilantes were at every train station. People got off. If they sounded like they weren't from here, they were usually encouraged to get back on the train and go back where they came from. The National Democratic Party chose to meet in Charleston in May 1860. If you had wanted to pick a location in the country where you knew trouble would take place, you would have picked Charleston. And so as delegates came to Charleston in May, the platform committee was meeting, and it decided it wanted moderation. Yes, we've got Southern planters, we've got slaveholders, but we also got a lot of voters in Pennsylvania and New York, and we're going to have to get those voters in order to win an election. Well, the platform committee prevailed over the radicals who wanted to have the platform say slavery is a positive good for the country. When they failed on the floor of the convention to get that put into the platform, radicals led by William Lowndes Yancey of Alabama, and you might see from his name, he originally was from South Carolina, with a name like Lowndes, walked out, and the South Carolina delegation followed. And so the National Democratic Party divided into Northern Democrats or National Democrats and Southern Democrats. The National Democratic Party held a later convention and nominated Stephen Douglas of Illinois. The Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. And a new party came up, the Constitutional Unionists, who nominated John Bell of Tennessee, hoping that would be a middle way, a moderate party. And the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. Now, if the Republicans are united, the Democrats are divided, and there's a third party, it didn't take a political scientist to figure out Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans were going to win the election. That's the way the Electoral College works. Thanks, remember, to the South Carolina delegation to the Constitutional Convention. There was a conservative coup back in South Carolina. The radicals were in control, they thought. But the conservatives, older South Carolinians, knew that Lincoln was going to win. As soon as the Democratic Party split, they knew that Lincoln would win. But they didn't want South Carolina to be run by the radicals, especially politicians like Robert Barnwell Rhett. And so therefore, They co-opted the radical policy of separate state action, unilateral secession. Old-line politicians such as Senator James Henry Hammond argued that secession over an election was foolish. It's got to be a constitutional issue. Seceding over the election of a Republican had nothing to do with principles, and that's what he thought was supposed to be important. But practicality won out over principles. Secession was going to be a reality, and the old guard in South Carolina was going to make sure that the radicals were not in charge. During the run-up to the election, Lincoln's election was equated to abolitionism, and that meant Africanization, and that was the term they used. It'll be like Haiti or worse. With the Republican Party in control, the slaves will be freed, our women are at risk. We are outnumbered in this state, 60-40, we will be outvoted. And if you're not a slaveholder, if the slaves are freed, they will be competition for white labor in the state, to yeoman farmers, and they'll put you out of business. So social and political and economic issues were thrown out. It came from the pulpit as well as from the political platform, and certainly in all of the press. When Lincoln was elected, the announcement was made in November. The General Assembly of South Carolina met on the 6th of November, 1860, to choose presidential electors and then remain in session until they got the results. Lincoln wins. The General Assembly calls for a secession convention, a convention of the people. Now, this is the third convention of the people in South Carolina history. 1719, 1775, now in 1860. The convention met first in Columbia on December the 17th, 1860, but then adjourned to Charleston because of an alleged smallpox epidemic. Some Columbians and some historians agree with them that the real reason was that Columbia might have been too moderate a city where a convention could take place, whereas Charleston by this time was wholeheartedly in the radical camp. On December the 20th, 1860, the convention passed a resolution: the Union is dissolved. South Carolina's 169 delegates present at that convention voted to secede. It was unanimous. No other southern state was unanimous in voting to leave the Union. Now, why secession? And I'm quoting now from delegates to that convention. To save all that we hold most dear, our property, our institutions, our honor. And like all good English people, Anglo-Saxons, when you have a revolution, you justify the causes. South Carolinians did that in 1719, justified why they were rebelling against the proprietors. They certainly did that in 1775 and 76, and they did it in 1860. They published a declaration of the immediate causes as to why South Carolina was seceding from the Union. Included the threats to slavery, and Lawrence M. Kit, the congressman from Orangeburg, said slavery was the great central point from which we are now proceeding. They made no bones about what was important. The white population was joyful. Free persons of color were fearful, and an exodus of free persons that had begun in the late 1850s speeded up. James Lewis Pettigrew, great lawyer, a longtime unionist, said, South Carolina is too small to be a republic and too large to be an insane asylum. And Mr. Perry, Oliver Perry from up north, from Greenville, said, if South Carolina was determined to go to the devil, I will go with her. And so in December 1860, South Carolina voted to leave the Union, and within 6 months, a war would begin, which the politicians in December 1860 said would never take place.